When they attack black people after they've been murdered, when they did absolutely nothing wrong, you're pushing us to the limit. And what do I mean by that? You're asking us to talk about history, the history of the South. This is in Georgia. What happened in Georgia? There were savages in Georgia. It was the ancestors of the white right-wingers. They were absolute savages. They murdered people, they lynched people, they raped people, they enslaved people. They took babies from their mothers and sold them as property. You want to talk about savages? Your ancestors were the biggest savages the world has ever seen. And so don't you dare call a black man a savage after you murdered him. Don't you dare do that. I'm so sick of African Americans being called violent when the world's worst violence was done to them, not by them, to them, not by them. For God's sake, you want to do racist stereotypes? If it fit anywhere, and it doesn't, but if it fit anywhere, it would certainly fit white right-wingers in the South, who has hundreds of years of history of being savages. Savages. They snatched babies and they sold them as property and they raped their mothers. Savages. That's what they were. You want to talk about stereotypes? Screw all of you who still defend that Confederacy, that monstrosity. Anyone who defends that is a barbaric savage.
That's why they don't want to teach American history in public schools. That's why there's been a strong orchestrated effort to prevent the teaching of anything that you just mentioned right now. Because, hey, God forbid that, children learn about the real savages in this country's history.
Europeans come to this continent, literally ethnically cleanse the indigenous population out of existence, kill them on a scale that has hardly been equaled, and refer to them as savages. That's an achievement. Who's the savage? The first time I encountered this was in a little town in Massachusetts called Deerfield. It's a reconstruction of what that little town looked like in colonial America. And in front of each house is a plaque that explains something about this house. And then description. On the 18th of October of 1702, the savages attacked. The first time I saw this, the savages. You come in here, destroy everything these people have, and they are the savages. That's an interesting move.
It is.
I hadn't thought of that before.
Think about it.
I'm not sure who needs to hear this, but saying that black people were better off under slavery and Jim Crow because they committed less crimes is not a political opinion. Saying that black women don't have equal cognitive functioning to white people, and if they are in high up positions, that must mean that they took a white person's slot, is not a political opinion. Believing that black men who die because of police violence deserved it is not a political opinion. Saying that you don't believe 1 in 5 women are actually SA'd, so then 1 in 5 women must be lying, is not a political opinion. That is white supremacy and misogyny.
Somebody said what they couldn't do by themselves, they decided to do it with a pen. And I guess that's exactly what we see play out in history today. Okay, that's it. Okay, these people saw that they couldn't literally unleash, or remove or wipe out the people that they had in mind. Somehow, God took over. So they decided to use their pen by rewriting history, and we all are seeing history being whitewashed in our eyes. But the truth can never be hidden for long. Guys, you're welcome back again to my YouTube channel. It's so good to have you. Thank you so much for clicking when you saw this video. So I'm going to let the rest of the videos roll, and I'll come back with more commentary. Credit belongs to original creators of these videos. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and drop your own take in the comment. So let's go watch, then I'll come back with more.
But I would like to say what scares us is I think we hear violence.
The young lady said she's afraid of violence. And isn't it sad that we who have been the victims of so much violence, now whites fear violence from us? We do not have a history of killing white people. White people have a history of killing us. See? And what you fear, may I say this, sir? What you fear, and it's a deep guilt thing that white folks suffer. You are afraid that if we ever come to power, we will do to you and your fathers what you and your people have done to us. And I think you are judging us by the state of your own mind, and that is not necessarily the mind of black people.
White culture is formed in savagery. I also said there isn't a place on God's green earth that they haven't come there and decimated the native inhabitants. There isn't a place. They are murderous savages. That's their culture. They call it conquest. We call it savagery. This is broad history. This is the history of white cultures. When they have the intention to invent a weapon, they don't just invent a weapon that can harm an enemy in one-to-one combat. No. They invent bombs that can decimate entire populations. They invent viruses like smallpox that they spread amongst unvaccinated Native Americans and then decimate their populations. And therefore the Americas, have got a native population which is less than the settler population in certain countries like Argentina. I mean, even a country like Brazil, yes, obviously there are still some native inhabitants there, but their population is less than those who were brought in from Africa as slaves, as well as those who came in as European settlers in the colonial times. So the culture of white people throughout white history, even to this very date, is that of savagery. It's that of inhumane behavior that is normalized to the point where they feel like they're entitled to behave like that.
The only reason that white people in the United States or anywhere we are, in Europe, in Africa, in Australia, in Israel, wherever we are the colonizers. We are the colonizers, and we live off the expense of the assault, Europe's assault on Africa, the kidnapping of African human beings, the trafficking, all of these things that we hear today. This is where it came from. Hundreds of years of assaulting and stealing everything that African people and Africa as a continent had, and putting it into the hands of white people. And so this is why, as the chairman has said, the true class struggle, the true working class in the world is the African and colonized working class, not white people, because all white people, and you know this is true, you and I know this is true by just living our lives and seeing it. All white people sit on the pedestal, on the backs of African and indigenous people. And, the statistics are that even poor white people have an easier ability in a crisis to raise $3,000 in an emergency than middle-class African people do, because we live in social wealth.
White supremacists be like, we was conquerors and slave owners and shit. No, your ancestors were illiterate cousin fucking farmers. And the people who you claim to be descended from were also cousin fucking savages that reaped havoc across the world for economic gain. And most pathetically of all, here you are in the 21st century espousing the beliefs of racial hierarchy. You're a modern working class person under the delusions of fraudulent 18th century science. That is genuinely so fucking pathetic.
Let's talk about this story out of South Africa because it says everything about hypocrisy and white supremacy. A white farm owner and his workers are on trial for allegedly murdering 2 black women who were unarmed, women who were simply collecting old dairy products. And after they allegedly murdered them, they fed their bodies to pigs. Think about that for a second. They fed their bodies, human beings, to animals. The part that pisses me off the most with this is these are the same kind of people who look at black folks in Africa or America or anywhere else and call us savages. But tell me this, what is more savage than shooting 2 hungry women and then treating their bodies like trash? What's more barbaric than covering it up by feeding their bodies to animals? This isn't just a crime. This is a reflection of a long, ugly history. If you remember, colonizers stole land, they massacred villages, and they called it civilization. Slave masters whipped, raped, and lynched black bodies, and then had church the next morning. Apartheid made people strangers on their own land. And then when we resisted, they called us violent. See the pattern? Whenever black people act out of survival, we're branded as criminals. When white supremacists murder in cold blood, it's protecting property. It's isolated. It's lost in the news cycle somehow. And then you got politicians like Trump, who push this lie of a so-called genocide against white farmers, while ignoring the everyday violence against black South Africans. That's not just hypocrisy. That's propaganda trying to flip the script and make the oppressor the victim. You want to know the truth? Black people are not savages. What's in our blood is resilience, creativity, and survival against all odds. But what's in their history, their very foundation of white supremacy, is violence, exploitation, and the dehumanization of others. That's the real savagery. So the next time someone dares to point the finger at us, remind them, we didn't invent this cycle of brutality. They did. And we've been surviving it, exposing it, and rising above it for centuries. Now let me ask you this. When are we going to let them stop defining the narrative and start forcing the world to see the truth for what it is?
Hey everybody, Professor Moore here. So last week in my modern history course, we covered indigenous people. And one of the topics that we discussed was the demonization of Native Americans and the Declaration of Independence. In the 1776 Declaration, Thomas Jefferson calls Native Americans merciless Indian savages. And he argues that what makes them savages was that their rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. So there's 2 points to be made here. Number 1, yes, indigenous people did kill American settlers. However, these were violent acts of resistance against a genocidal settler colonialism. The second point is that, in my mind, this is a clear-cut case of psychological projection. Because what Jefferson was accusing the Native Americans of doing was exactly what Europeans and Americans were doing to indigenous people. Genocidal violence against indigenous people is something that started in 1492 with Christopher Columbus. However, in the decade before the American Revolution, it reached a new and horrifying dimension. After the British defeated the French in the French and Indian War in 1763, the British king made a deal with the Native American tribes they had been warring against. And the deal was that no more American colonists would take over their land. So in 1763, he issued the Royal Proclamation, which drew the proclamation line across the Appalachian Mountains. And if you see that map right there, you can see the British colonies on the East Coast there, and then right next to it is supposed to be independent Native American territory. So this is the deal that the British king made in 1763, that no more American colonists would cross over that proclamation line and take over any more indigenous land. However, the American colonists did not listen to the king. They basically said, screw you, we're going to continue to do what we've been doing and take over more indigenous territory. And that's exactly what they did. And it's interesting that in most American schools, we're taught that one of the first big grievances that the American revolutionists had against the British Empire was taxation without representation. It's all about the Stamp Acts and the Boston Tea Party. But in reality, one of the first cases of American colonists disobeying the British king and rebelling was going against the 1763 proclamation line, when the king drew that line and said, do not cross it and take more Native American land. The American colonists disobeyed. In fact, a decade after the proclamation was issued, over 50,000 settlers had crossed over that line and were taking over Native American territory. When American colonists crossed over the proclamation line, the explicit goal was to take over indigenous land, and in order to do that, they had to exterminate the people that were already living on that land. And one of the ways that they went about doing this was forming these local militias, or these vigilante groups, which were really nothing more than death squads or murder squads that were going out and committing horrific acts of violence against the Native Americans. There was a strong incentive for people to go out and to murder indigenous people. In 1763, one of these vigilante groups, these death squads in Philadelphia, were offering cash for evidence of dead Native Americans. And the evidence that they were requesting was the scalps of these individuals. And here are the cash rewards that they would offer to these individuals. They would pay you $134 for the scalp of an adult man, $130 for the scalp of an adult woman, and $50 for the scalp of a child. And it wasn't just these vigilante squads that were offering cash rewards for the scalps of Native Americans. In 1755, the governor of the town of Spencer, Massachusetts, offered cash rewards for Indian scalps. He gave out 50 pounds for the scalp of an adult man, and he issued 12 pounds for every scalp of such female Indian or male Indian under the age of 12 years old. So also offering cash rewards for the killing of women and children. And remember back to the Declaration of Independence, when Thomas Jefferson said what made Native Americans savage was that they killed regardless of age or sex. But we can see in these examples that the governors of towns and cities and states were offering cash reward for the killing of women and children. And just to give you an example of kind of how widespread and ingrained this practice was of murdering indigenous people, it's pretty shocking, but it took all the way until 2021 for Colorado to officially remove the law off of their law books that offered cash rewards for bringing in the scalps of indigenous men, women, and children. So you can see here in this photo from the Washington Post, the governor signing this and officially removing this law. But just imagine, even though it wasn't in use, it remained on the law book. This case of a state offering their citizens cash rewards for the killing of men, women, and children. The violence that American settlers unleashed on Native Americans only continued to grow worse and sometimes culminated in massacres that are almost completely lost to memory and history today. For example, in 1782 in Pennsylvania, one of these vigilante death squads murdered 96 members of the Delaware tribe, 96 Native American men, women, and children. And these individuals had actually recently converted to Christianity in a bid to save their lives, thinking that if they were fellow Christians, then they wouldn't be murdered. However, these vigilante members accused them of attacking white settlers, and so they brought 96 people, 2 at a time, behind a shed, and they brutally beat them to death over the head with a hammer. So this is the type of violence that happened. And this is just one single episode that I'm flagging up over hundreds. So this is the type of violence that American settlers were using against indigenous people. This type of genocidal violence against indigenous people is something that remains consistent throughout the 1600s, the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s. In fact, in the year 1900, celebrated children's book author L. Frank Baum released The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. I actually really loved this original book when I was a kid. However, I was shocked to hear L. Frank Baum's opinion about indigenous peoples. Here is what the children's book author said about Native Americans. He said, "The whites, by law of conquest, by justice of civilization, are masters of the American continent, and the best safety of the frontier settlements will be secured by the total annihilation of the few remaining Indians. Why not annihilation? Their glory has fled, their spirit broken, their manhood effaced. Better that they die than live, the miserable wretches that they are." This type of genocidal rhetoric and this language of total annihilation, total extermination can be found everywhere you look. It was U.S. Army General Philip Sheridan who coined the famous phrase, "The only good Indian is a dead Indian." U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt said, "I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indians are dead Indians, but I believe that 9 out of every 10 are." The Civil War General William T. Sherman is rightly praised for his role in defeating the Confederacy during the Civil War. However, when it came to America's war against its indigenous people, here's the views that he expressed. "We must act with vindictive earnestness against the Sioux, even to their extermination, men, women, and children. During an assault, the soldiers cannot pause to distinguish between male and female, or even to discriminate as to age." And that's exactly what happened. In 1861, U.S. Army Captain Nicholas Hote described how during one battle, the Navajos, squaws, and children ran in all directions and were shot and bayoneted. "I saw a soldier murdering 2 little children and a woman. I yelled immediately to the soldier to stop. He looked up, but did not obey my order. I ran up as quick as I could, but could not get there soon enough to prevent him from killing the 2 innocent children and wounding severely the squaw." So think back to the Declaration of Independence and Jefferson calling Native Americans savages because of their undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. We can clearly see that this is what the Europeans and the Americans were doing against indigenous people, and it should be called by its true name, genocide.
Whether you like it or not, the truth remains that the history that we all know, that we are all reading in classrooms today, that our children are being taught, and we all still in school doing our masters or our PhDs, are learning, or even BSc. Trust me, that's not history. That's not history. It's not history. They have literally watered it down to suit their specifics. They know exactly what they are doing. They have whitewashed the history that we all know. So a few times, like some months ago, I came across a post on Facebook where this young lady was literally sharing a story about their professor in school in the US. So this professor, either the US or the UK, yeah. So this professor was sharing about history and showcasing, that how environment has something to do with people's upbringing, and talking about how, he showed a particular place in America and say that these people, they are so, they are top notch or in a particular place today because of the environment they grew up in. And she brought up, she just kept bringing up different places, and she brought up somewhere in China. Is it China or India? No, not India. I think either China or Japan. Okay, any of those places, I don't know, but I've forgotten, but I know it was in Asia because this professor is an Asian woman. So she brought up and was like, oh, that this is how, their place is, and this is the reason why she is who she is today. Her environment had reshaped her and all of that. Then she decided to bring up Africa and brought out a very dirty slum and said that this is how Africa is currently, and that's why most of them have been affected. And this lady, being the only African in that class, color me red when I tell you that everybody turned and literally was looking at her. I was like, oh, Africa, this is how your place is. And you know that notion. So this lady, she didn't say anything. She just kept quiet. Everybody, was literally looking at her. And she just kept quiet and kept calm. I was thinking about the next way to showcase herself. So the professor gave them like a research work to do research on something, that has to do with environment and, the same thing she thought. So she went and brought out beautiful pictures from Africa that I doubt if, I don't know why they always paint Africa that way, right? But yeah. So she brought out this beautiful picture and brought out different places. Then she went to this woman's place. Either one of those Asian countries I've forgotten because it was long ago that I read that. And he brought out a very dirty corner in that place. And it was everybody presented and everybody was clapping for everyone for presenting. It got to her turn. She came out, stood in the classroom and turned on the, presenting her slide. And she got to the Asian part and she said, this is exactly what their place looks like. And that's why we have a lot of them, living in poverty. And she brought out the percentage of people living in poverty in that particular country and all of that. The professor felt like the ground should open to that. Yeah. And she said that none of the students clapped for her. Yeah. They actually were expecting her to keep calm, but nobody clapped for her. She did her presentation and said thank you, and she walked in. And that is how you show your respect and also drop your name boldly somewhere. I loved it. I literally loved it. You don't have to come argue and say, why did you bring this picture? Why did it? No, she had to now show them that this is exactly what it is. The history that we all know, it has been watered down to the lowest or the barest minimum. But somehow they tell us that that's history. They keep telling us, painting different things, brown, black, red, and yellow, mix up together, give to our children, give to us. We all grew up knowing different types of history until we started, researching on our own and beginning to find out by ourselves that what they told us those days, that wasn't history. That was a whitewashed lie. Anyway, guys, I'm going to end here, but I'd love to hear your own take as well. Let's talk about it. Credit belongs to original creators of these videos. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and drop your own take in the comment section. And I'll see you all on my next. Thank you so much, guys, for watching, and see you all next time. Bye, my love.